apologetics must be a part of church discipleship.
That's why morality is relative in Americans throughout the West today, because man now determines truth.
And I believe that that's why the nation is in the state it's in, because they don't know the Word of God, and because the church has failed, in a sense, to hold forth the Word of God in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation.
Welcome to Heritage of Truth. Today we welcome back Stephen Burnett and Jared Moore. Welcome back.
Thanks much. It's good to be back.
For the sake of your book, how do you define pop culture?
You know, it's image-bearing work that is popular. You know, I mean, I know that's a simplistic definition, but it indicates the value of it by referring to image bearers. So it's not trivial. It's not, something that's to be totally rejected in most cases. You know, some of it is just inherently sin throughout, but for the most part, it's grace mixed with idolatry, common grace mixed with idolatry. You know, we see the image bearing, which is the fingerprints of God and the creative work and the beauty, and the storytelling. And just like you're talking about the story of redemption, that is present. I mean, in almost all these superhero movies, for example, there's tons of redemption just all over the place in a lot of them. And it's just because it's image bearers ripping off the best story that's ever been told,
Yeah.
And, we want to encourage folks to, engage, to utilize pop culture, but also to enjoy the fingerprints of God that are present in pop culture. When an individual submits to his or her conscience and creates culture while submitting to his or her conscience, that conscience didn't come from evolution or fall out of the sky, or it's not arbitrary. It is something that is designed by God to direct and to help restrain evil, but also to produce common good. And so we can celebrate that if we connect it rightly back to God. And, I think that parents need to engage culture with their children for this purpose, to enjoy God's fingerprints wherever they're found, but also to recognize man's idols. And so, because these idols that are present in pop culture are all around us. There are children, you lock them up, you can't lock them up from their heart. Many of the idols that you see in pop culture, that we see in pop culture, are already present in our children's hearts. Mm-hmm. And so by teaching them how to reject those, and how the gospel is much better, how what God provides is much better than what idols promise, we can send our children not merely running to morality or running to pragmatism or running to what is best for them, but running to the God who made them for his glory, to see the beauty that is God himself. And we really have a wonderful opportunity with these popular cultural works to magnify these realities, so that children will not only reject those idols, but reject the idols that are from their flesh in their hearts, and enjoy, as Stephen said, to enjoy God forever.
What are some examples of these popular idols?
Well, first, to define that term very carefully, and I think this may be one of the biggest challenges to at least the themes that we're talking about. There's a recent history among some Christians who rightfully are trying to engage popular culture, and we will write books or movie reviews or talk amongst ourselves. And instead of speaking in terms of what are the idols of the story or game or music or whatever, we'll say, what's the bad stuff? And by bad stuff, we mean, where are the violent moments? What are the bad words they said, and how often did they say them? Did anyone take off their clothes when they weren't supposed to?
Right.
All those things may indeed be tempting to children and to plenty of adults, by the way. Let's not minimize that risk. Mm-hmm. Especially the sexual temptation element is probably the worst of the lot, I would personally say.
Yes.
But when we speak of idols, we're speaking of things that the story says will fulfill the hopes, but the story cannot do that. If you watch a superhero movie or a Star Wars movie and there's a happy ending and all the teddy bears are celebrating on the moon of Endor, and Luke gets to see his dad redeemed at the end of Star Wars Episode 6, and then the very next movie, it's all gone away. The bad guys come back. You cannot save the galaxy, and it stays saved. not only does the story need to keep going, but they can't promise that happy ending and deliver on that promise. And an idol like that sounds kind of abstract, but what if it's something gentler, like a princess movie? People will get a little too uptight about the princess movies sometimes, but there is a risk there, that you have to be this perfect animated creature who gets her prince by the end, or just finds some kind of satisfaction by the end, even if we get rid of the prince. What kind of idols will that pull out of a child's heart?
Even the idea of needing satisfaction
Oh
can be
yes,
an idol. Yeah.
the idea is a good one. It is true. And that's why the basic structure of the story is good, in that if it's well done, it is saying something has gone wrong with the world and needs to be fixed. A character has a quest they need to go on, or a longing they need to have met. But the story itself, by itself, according to its own rules, cannot meet that longing. So, those are a few examples of the idols. We can certainly think of many more. But what we recommend in our 5 questions is that is after going over the story, what it's about, what kind of world we're in, and what is good and true and beautiful about the story. In question 4, we say not just what are the bad parts of the story, but what is false and idolatrous about the story. And most importantly, and this calls for creativity, how does it fall apart when you poke it? Because none of those things can fulfill their own longings that they're bringing up. It will fall apart if you apply the worldview to itself. And then in the question 5, you don't just bring in Jesus as an example of the better and truer Iron Man, or some of those cornier things that people, I think, with good intentions try to do, but it can be pretty shallow. Instead, you say, okay, now how does Jesus fulfill forever and truly the good longings that the story on its own raises but cannot fulfill, or that the story answers only with something that ends up idolatrous and sinful and disordered?
Okay, so you mentioned the 5 questions. What are those 5 questions?
They're adapted from Apologetics, which is our co-author's book from 2012.
That's Ted Turneau in absentia, but he is as much a co-author as both of us.
Oh yeah. So what is the story? What is the story is the first question. So you want to treat this image bearer with dignity and value, and so you want to get his or her story right. And so there is even though the person's a sinner, they may be a pagan, they may be a Muslim, they may be a contrary religion, or they may be an atheist, but they're still an image bearer, and so their story is important, and treating them with dignity. And so trying to understand their story, what are they arguing, what are who are the main characters, what's the plot, that's important. So that's the first question. The second is, what is the moral and imaginary world? And so kind of the world that they've presented, the world that they've constructed, the world that they're defining. Is it our world? Is it some world that doesn't exist? Is it a world that they hope will exist? Or is it today it's popular to kind of say that conservatism has destroyed everything, and there's this dystopian creation. But whatever the world is, getting that right out of respect again for the image bearer. And then what is good, true, and beautiful in this world? What are the fingerprints of God? An image bearer has created this work, and what good have they created here? Usually there is a clear good and clear evil. For example, this is largely in the horror genre. You think of like the movie A Quiet Place. Which, by the way, Jeannie, if you haven't seen it,
no, I haven't.
Watch it.
It's pretty scary, and it's not for every kid or even every adult, but it is a really good example of common grace in storytelling.
It is probably the most complementary biblical view of manhood and womanhood that Hollywood has put out in a long time.
It's amazing.
And it's really good. And I don't believe there's any language in it, and there's no sexuality either, but there is violence because it's aliens, and they're scary aliens.
Well, it helps to have no bad words in it, because nobody hardly says anything.
That's true. They hunt by sound. They hunt by sound. So
right. That's part of the question too. There, the story world. That's what the world requires, because these evil creatures can hear from miles and miles away. So if you sneeze, they'll come get you.
But the common grace, there's a lot of good, true, and beautiful things and stories that draw, and that lots of times that's what draws us to these stories. Why are so many people going to watch these movies and participate in the pop culture? Now, sometimes it's sinister and sin, but in many cases, it is ultimately a longing for God. It's just they're searching for His presence in the wrong things. But nevertheless, as a Christian, we can recognize where this goodness comes from in these stories by people. They deny God with their lips, but not with their pop culture.
Yeah.
It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. And when you say image bearer, it's because we are created in the image of God, right?
Yeah, Genesis 1:26-28, male and female, made to reflect God back to Him. And even though that image is marred, it is not destroyed. And so we celebrate that wherever it's found. And then number 4 is, what is the false and idolatrous in this world? And so as Stephen said, what
You mean
is
the world of the story?
Yes, the world of the story. What is the false gospel, so to speak? What is the way that the main character is saved or fulfilled, or the goal? And you point out that idol. Now, every story's got one, unless they're a distinctly Christian story. But most have a false gospel, and this will just increase, as our culture becomes more and more away from God. Even though they'll argue common grace things, they will present many idols. And then finally, how is Jesus the true answer to this story's hopes? And so, as Stephen said, how does Jesus deliver what the idol promises? And in most cases, the idol promises something good, something that is not inherently sinful usually. But the truth is that only our Creator can fulfill us. Only the one whose image we were created in can meet our needs and meet our desires and fulfill them eternally. And the only way that can happen is through the finished work of God the Son incarnate, Jesus Christ. Redemption, reconciliation, regeneration, salvation, and so we want to celebrate that. And I think I've done this with my children and continuing to do it. And I'm praying that it is beneficial, because it's interesting. Pop culture provides so many avenues. It's making an argument about the real world in most cases. The idol is a real world idol usually. And so pointing that out, it's a temptation. If our kids aren't tempted with it yet in their hearts, they probably will be, because it's a common temptation. If it's in pop culture, it's probably a common temptation, a common idol. And so we can help train our children to reject that and show them how Jesus is better.
Stephen and Jared, I want to thank you for being our guests today, and we'll talk more next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
I know